Welcome, everybody, and really excited, as usual, to have a great speaker, but a really great speaker, who, Madeline Ashby, who's here today to inspire us, maybe make us think a little bit different. And as usual, I'm not going to get too much into her background. You can always read about her online or any of her books. But I will say that she has a history in our language, English, and also in history, and then strategic foresight. And she's kind of a well-known sci-fi writer. And she also gets pulled from around the world to kind of get into these X problems where a traditional agency, maybe the UN or the World Health Organization, has maybe recognized that they're not doing a good job or they're a little lost. And so Madeline's the kind of person that gets pulled into the when we're a little lost situation. And I think as we look at this, this series, where we're thinking about design thinking for resilience, I think we can all admit we're a little lost. So I'm hoping that Madeline will inspire us, give us a little bit of, not too much, but maybe something practical that we could do that helps in the creative process or the innovation process. And then we'll have a few minutes of questions, and you can follow up with her then. So without further ado, it's my honor to turn it over to you.
Very much. Thank you so much. My name's Madeline Ashby, and I live in Toronto. So I'm extremely glad to be in San Diego right now. I left thunder snow, which is when there's thunder and snow. So that's fun. The title of this talk is Resilience, was going to be like Resilience is Repetition. And then we were sort of talking about it a little bit more, and we decided that there needed to be a little bit of a subtitle there, which is Repetition times Diversity equals Innovation. I might, if you have other suggestions, let me know. Titles are always like the last thing that I get on my books. Someone asked me about how the title for the book that's coming out in August came about, because that'll be like a good half-hour answer. So I write books. I also write short stories. These are some of my books and some of the anthologies that my short stories have appeared in. I tend to write near future science fiction, I guess you would call it, near future grounded science fiction. I tend to actually read the abstracts in Discover or Nature. I try to back up, my fictional lies with a kernel of truth. I try to imagine from what is already possible. It's sort of like Chopped. If you watch Chopped, you know that you'll be asked to create something out of something completely outlandish. So can you put dinner together out of durian, marshmallow fluff, and beef jerky? You could, but it's gonna require a great deal of creativity. And when you're talking about like carbon aerogel and polymer doped memristor skins, you get self-replicating humanoid robots, like in VN. Or whatever else. These are, okay, that actually does have some of the anthologies that I've worked on. Sometimes when people contact me, or actually no, let me just say, I changed the order of these slides, you can tell. This is the book that I have coming out in August. It's called Glass Houses. It's about a startup stranded on an island whose sole structure is a black glass cube. At first, it's hard to get in, and then it's very hard to get out. So thank you for granting me the opportunity to rehearse the act of talking about it in front of a group, because I have until August to get good at that. These are some of my clients. So I have a degree in strategic foresight and innovation. It's my second master's. I have a master's of design despite not being able to draw a straight line. I got that from OCADU University, which is used to be a college of art and design in Toronto. I was part of the initial graduating cohort, but the degree itself is in strategic foresight and innovation. I blend that with my sort of training as a science fiction writer and my experience as a writer generally, in that my clients tend to come to me for one thing. And even though I can facilitate workshops, I can do a trends report, I've done those things before, but the thing that normally people come to me for, or most often come to me for, is they want a short story set in the world that they have researched, the sort of foresight scenario, or they want a short story about something very specific, like what does a world without antibiotics look like? Or what will the pandemic look like 2 years from now? Or what would happen if, what if our technology plus years plus demographic? And that's about it. Again, the chopped metaphor stands us in good stead here. We have a person in a place with a problem. We have a setting, a time period, a technology, and a user, right? And we can run that experiment a lot in fiction, often more easily than we can run it with actual users or in the lab. I also sometimes write for Wired, and you'll notice that in the corner of this frame is a piece of art that Andy Warhol did about Prince. I wrote about the, Warhol Foundation v. Goldsmith case for Wired, which has implications for the future of generative AI. But you'll notice that repetition is a theme here. Like in this slide, this is going to become a theme. So I'm going to tell you a story about resilience before I sort of get into my own experiences. So in 435 BCE, Athens, builders finished what is now known as the Odeon of Pericles, a covered music hall at the southeastern corner of the Acropolis intended for annual, month-long competitions honoring the city's namesake goddess, Athena. Pericles may be familiar to you because he's the leader who shaped the Delian League into the Athenian Empire. At the time, these leaders were referred to as strategoi, or I think that's the pronunciation, I may be wrong. And to this day, when we think about leadership, we think of strategists. We think about keen strategists, people who understand not just the problem in front of them, but the problems that created that problem. They understand what we as writers would call the backstory. And it's because they know the backstory that they can write a different one. Now, my understanding, and possibly yours as well, about narrative and how we tell stories and why we tell stories and what their virtues and values are, or what the value of using them for, comes from Walter J. Ong's Orality and Literacy. Ong theorizes, or sort of gets at the idea that before we had writing, we told each other stories orally. And because we couldn't write things down, we needed to invent a linguistic memory system. And that's how we invented memes. We got epithets and mnemonic devices. That's why fair-haired Athena is always fair-haired. It's why rosy-fingered Dawn is always rosy-fingered. It's why the wine-dark sea is always wine-dark, because also they didn't have a word for blue. So we needed, our species needed to communicate information in a memorable, compelling, interesting, but portable way. And there is nothing more portable and interesting and compelling than a story. So what's also interesting about that place I just told you about is that the Odeon was was a place where Pericles sort of funded publicly the ability for lower classes to go and see the theater, which previously they had not been able to do. But he wanted all voters to be able to take in the theater. Why? Because they were at war and they needed a shared narrative. He kept everybody on the same page, or in this case, the same sheet of pressed lambskin. But the temple itself was clad in cedar wood that had been stolen from Persian warships. And that cedar wood is probably the same kind of cedar wood that we now call, or we're now referred to as, Lebanon cedars or the cedars of God. Why are they called that? The classics people in the audience, whoever you may be, there's always one, may know, but it's because they were cedar trees that were theorized to be the same ones that Gilgamesh used to build his city, Uruk, in Sumeria. So the cedars of God, that species of cedar, was used for building Uruk, was used for building the Pericles of Odeon. And why? Because it was the most resilient tree that anyone could find. They were impervious to most flame. They were impervious to earthquakes. They were impervious to storms. It was incredibly hard to chop them down. That's why it's a task in the Epic of Gilgamesh for Gilgamesh to chop them down, because they were seen as hard as iron. And it was why they were the masts of worships and the cladding around a temple. And later, those same timbers that were around, that cladded the temple, were used as battering rams. That's how hard, that's how much carbon had been sunk into those trees. So I want you to kind of keep this in mind. Just this story. So the other thing that I usually tell people about storytelling in futures is that to work in futures, you have to tell people things they don't want to hear, or that they might not be ready to hear, or they might not be ready to imagine. You have to have difficult conversations. And that is when it is really useful to tell a story. Because a story doesn't necessarily belong to any one person in the company, organization, what have you. It's not Bob from accounting saying, "See, I told you so." It's not someone finally piping up 5 years after they finally had the idea. One of the first workshops that I ever took part in or ran myself, we were talking about sort of problems endemic to an industry. And someone, when we were done, one of my participants said something, and then he looked at me and he's like, "I've thought about this every day for 3 years, and I've never told anybody about it until now." And that's an enormously powerful position to be in. I'm extremely privileged. I'm extremely lucky to be able to hear stuff like that. But it does mean that you're the carrier of people's stories as well. And that's actually kind of a big deal and a big responsibility, because you're carrying secrets that aren't necessarily trade secrets, but they're the things that people won't admit to or are afraid to admit to about their hopes and anxieties for the future. So, who's good at this? I'm okay at it. I've gotten some things right in my fiction. I've predicted some things. But other people are way better at me than this. And the classic example I like to bring up is Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler got a MacArthur Genius Grant. She was so good at this. For Parable of the Sower, which won a ton of awards. And what she said about her work was, "All I did was look around at the problems we're ignoring now and give them about 30 years to grow into full-fledged disasters." She wrote Parable of the Sower in the 80s. She wrote it about a polluted world where there were drugs in almost every, source of water, source of food. They were altering people at the genetic level, and there were increasing numbers of corporate platforms that had turned into towns. And there was an American president who was an authoritarian whose slogan was "Make America Great Again," which she actually took from Reagan. But she was, her batting average was pretty great, right? In part because she said the thing that other people weren't going to say, right? So how do you do it? Because a story is a piece of art, right? Art gives us an opportunity to relate in seeing how others see or reading how others read. We see them anew. We find out more things about people. Now, you can use a plot structure. You can go take classes. You can do a lot of things. You can, figure out how to save the cat. You can do all this stuff. I will remind you that a plot is more than just a plot. It's a defined area designated for a certain purpose, which is also true about foresight scenarios. Sometimes a plot is a secret plan, which is also true about foresight scenarios, sometimes. And sometimes a plot is where things get buried, which can also be true of some foresight scenarios. When you're writing a story like the ones that I have to write often, or not have to write, that I'm actually very lucky to write, the ones that I'm often charged with writing, it's sort of like trying to figure out how to pack an entire life inside a tiny house. Like, how do you pack all the information necessary, everything that you're trying to communicate, everything that you want your audience to walk away with has to fit inside 500 words or 1,000 words. And also it has to be really interesting, and it has to be written for crowds that may not read for pleasure, that may actually have a terrible relationship with reading because they had a terrible time in undergrad, highlighting textbooks, leaned up against a laundry machine, hoping to stay awake. That was my experience of undergrad in a lot of ways. So where did I learn how to do this? Not by the laundry machine. So I'm a member of one of the oldest science fiction or genre writers workshops in Toronto. I started this way with the Cecil Street Irregulars, so named for the Cecil Street Community Center in Toronto, pictured here, which is where it began meeting. And they began meeting at the behest of this woman, Judith Merrill, who was a science fiction writer and editor who became the science fiction or the writer in residence for the Toronto Public Library. And she sort of started the practice of writers' workshops in high schools and writers' workshops at the library. And this is the one that she started. When I joined it, they were almost on the cusp of their 20-year anniversary. And the way that they got there was by meeting every Monday at the same time, in the same place, every week, without fail, barring illness or vacation or travel or conventions, I guess. So for over 20 years, they did the same thing in the same place with the same people, with a rotating cast sometimes, new members, old members. But they built a lot of trust. They built a lot of community. They shared goals. They shared dreams. They were vulnerable to one another. And they were really successful because that was the output. And that's not even all the output. That's like as much as I could fit into one image. I came out of this. I started this when I auditioned for this sort of group when I came to Canada. I couldn't work and I couldn't study, so I could only grind. And I found out about a writer's workshop from a listserv that I was on, the International Association of the Fantastic and the Arts, go IAFA. I asked around about workshops in Toronto. Someone referred me. Later, I wrote an email and they said, well, okay, send us something and we'll see. Send us a short story. I sent them a short story. And they're like, okay, why don't you come in with another short story, and then what we're going to do is we're going to critique it in front of you, and you can't say anything. You cannot respond until the end. And your response, like how you handle this, may determine whether or not we invite you into this thing that we've been doing for close to 20 years together as friends. And I was like, okay, sure. So I do it. And I get there and I'm half everybody's age. And they later told me, we thought that you were a 50-something divorcee because you were so polite. You were more polite than real Canadians. And I was like, well, I really wanted something. I minded my P's and Q's. So I show up, and I was able to sit through it. Why was I able to sit through this? Why was I able? How did I get good at sitting through crits without saying anything, without rebutting until I was asked? Well, how do I know so much about the Greeks? How do I know so much about Pericles? How do I know so much about orality and literacy and that kind of theory? I was part of a classics-based honors program in my undergraduate years. I spent my first 2 years of university with the same 24 other people in the same 3 classes, history, literature, and philosophy, every day for 2 years. Heraclitus to Hitler in 2 years. And we did the same things together. We paper conferenced all of our papers. We had to critique each other on everything we wrote. We did multiple rounds of these for every essay we wrote. And then, at the end of term, we didn't do exams, as you may think of them. There were no multiple choice. There were no true or false. There were no sit here while the computer watches you to see if you're looking off camera. None of that. We did oral finals, which means that the prof can ask you anything. Anything at all. Might be related to what was taught in class. Sometimes we had to recite like Roman poetry. Sometimes we were given the questions ahead of time, but wouldn't necessarily know which ones would be asked. Sometimes you pick the questions out of a hat. And other times, they would just ask you stuff that came up in class that they hoped you'd remembered. So at one point, I got asked, although it was not on the list and I had not prepared, one of my teachers asked me to explain how the history of stock characters in Roman comedy had influenced stock characters on American television. And I talked about Law and Order and Dick Wolf and bad cops and good cops and, you know, the sneaky person who is the ultimate villain, blah, blah, blah. So I had done this again and again and again, and it made me good at crits or sitting there, so on, listening to that kind of thing, essentially defending myself. So I then went and did a bunch of thesis defenses as well. But what do we learn from that? This. That repetition with a different cast of characters will get you great results, or can get you great results, if you curate your community and nurture it. If you meet regularly, if you communicate regularly, if you keep up with each other, if you keep tabs, if you email people back or text them back or call them back, if you set up something that is automated, because that's what we did. We automated our contact with each other. We had made a decision about when we would meet and how and what would be allowed and what the rules were and where the boundaries were. And then we repeated that process. We essentially repeated an experiment again and again and again. And the safety of that space allowed people to bring They're very vulnerable projects. Forward. All of you have probably been in the position of showing somebody something that is half done or barely started or a few steps away from finishing, and it is very hard. It can be really damaging when it goes wrong, right? It is very helpful when you have figured out a process by which people can bring forward those ideas, because that is how you are going to get the secrets that I mentioned before, right? You have to establish a rapport. Interrogators will tell you the same thing. You have to establish a rapport. You have to make people feel safe. And it is only then that they will give up the thing that they know that you don't. Or they will show you the thing that is going to change everything, right? And that goes back to this. Oral tradition in the Homeric epics and elsewhere relies on the idea that we used fiction as sort of what Ursula K. Le Guin calls the carrier bag. She had this idea, she calls it the carrier bag theory of fiction, that we use story to transmit information because it's incredibly dense but also very portable. But every time we tell a story, it changes slightly, right? It changes based on our audience, based on our recollection, based on our where we are, how much time we have, all kinds of stuff. That's often seen as sort of a vulnerability to storytelling, like, oh, her story wasn't the same the second time. But the reality might be that we're actually either remembering more or we're understanding what people are getting out of it. We might actually just be getting better at it every time we tell the story. Much like this. Why do we drill in football? We do it to get better. Why do we rehearse? We do it to get better. We do it again and again and again until we hate everyone around us, but we do it by instinct, right? We do it until, that's why it's called a repetitive strain injury. It's not because it happened the first time. And in fact, most writers know this, most creators know this. It is a game of endurance. James Baldwin, I think, kind of put it best. He said, talent is insignificant. I know a lot of talented ruins. Beyond talent lie all the usual words: discipline, love, luck, but most of all, endurance. And he said that, I believe, 2 years before he died. Most writers will tell you that, you're going to have a lot of rejections. You're going to get rejected. You're going to have bad crits. You're going to get told no a lot. That is one of the places that designers, founders, people who we now call innovators, that's something they have in common. They hear no a lot. And usually our problem with people at that level, I just saw an interview with Kara Swisher today, usually our problem with people at that level is that they've stopped hearing no. Usually the problem with your favorite writer, or the problem with your favorite game designer, the problem with your favorite whomever, musician, is that they stop hearing no. So they aren't getting that feedback. There is nothing for them to endure. There is no grit with which to make the pearl. The pearl comes from irritation in the oyster. You have to be irritated. You have to be uncomfortable. But you need a space to be uncomfortable in. Because if we're going to set up those safe systems for creativity, if we're going to set up all that automation, if we're going to set up, rules and boundaries and spaces and opportunities for people to bring forward their ideas, you actually have to have a system in place to do that. Virginia Woolf talks about it in A Room of One's Own, where she says, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. But that's basically everything. It's not just writing fiction, it's writing anything. It's having any kind of idea. Part of the reason that you are in this building is because it's the building that's been designated for you to have ideas in. Part of the reason it's great to live on campus when you are in undergrad is because you can have those 3 a.m. conversations over pizza. You can have those conversations that change your life. There's space for you to do that. And around that space was an entire system of funding and infrastructure and tradition and ideas and conversation and opportunity. Those things got put in place to guarantee chaos. It was space for chaos, right? You need space for those things. They have to be funded, they have to be fed, they have to be nurtured, they have to be watered or drunk, as the case may be. But you need the space for them. Or put another way, this is from Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Emergent Strategy. She says, do you understand that your quality of life and your survival are tied to how authentic and generous the connections between you and the people and place you live with and in? Are you actively practicing generosity and vulnerability in order to make the connections between you and others clear, open, available, durable? What is clear, open, available, and durable? Is that a resilient system? I would say so. I would say it's also a good relationship, and I would say that those are probably the same thing. A resilient relationship is these things. A resilient system is probably these things. A resilient company is probably these things. You know, your experience may vary, but the honesty, the generosity, the truth-telling, the vulnerability is what makes it so. Much like the workshop that I was in. Now, how that workshop ended is that after over, I believe, 30 years, the woman who hosted it, who had hosted it after they left the Cecil Street Community Center, died. It took death. And that, I think, should be a good lesson. That, you know, if you build it right, it will take force majeure before this can be eradicated. But the lesson, whatever came out of it, whatever creative work, whatever conversations, whatever relationships, whatever friendships came out of it, those endure because there was a space for them, because there was that place to experiment. There was that practice ground. There was that rehearsal space. There was that safety. There was that funding. And it wasn't necessarily tied to an outcome. The process is the work, right? And that's the one thing that I think a lot of people don't understand about both my job as a futurist, doing forecasting, doing strategic foresight, and my job as a fiction writer, is that the process itself is the joy. And if you can't find joy in that process, then you need to find another process. Because getting good at something feels great. What am I going to say? I have a slide with a lot of Legos, and I'm going to leave you with another little Greek tidbit. Even though I don't speak Greek, I didn't major in it. You should ask me about the other things I majored in. But I just really love this one little tidbit that I learned. And I learned it for, in fact, a piece on the writer's strike that just happened this year, or last year. Did you know that Lego and logos share the same root? What they mean is I organize or I build. And so that's sort of what I want to leave you with is I built.
That was wonderful. It was also short, so there's time to ask questions, which is amazing. She did what she said she would do, which is packaged something cool and something small. to give us space. I'm going to ask one question to get us started and put us in the mood, and then the rest of the team can ask questions. First, I have a really important question. What do you call a boomerang that doesn't come back? A stick. It's my new favorite joke. It came from my friend Mark Hancock, and I asked to hear it once a week. But I was actually thinking about that joke when you were talking. So, to get beyond being a stick, you have to work really hard. You have to do things that take hours. I don't know if you heard what she was telling you. She's worked really hard to get to where she is. So related to the question that I think maybe Don Norman didn't completely answer last week, of like, how do I succeed in life? She's telling you. It takes hard work and passion and repetition and innovation. So my question to you, and maybe we can take it from here and then we can run the mic. Or, Navarro, will you grab this one? Well, let's just sit together. Yeah. You sit wherever you want. So the world's leadership, I don't know, they're at COP or something like that, or they're all on a big yacht and it's blown up. So the entire global leadership has just been killed in this scenario. But luckily there was a writers' conference. So the only available people to save our world is a group of sci-fi writers, and in fact it's late in the evening, they've been drinking. It's the middle of the day. How do you save the world? What are you going to do? You're running this show.
I think first I would establish a routine. I think my answer would be like, first we establish a routine, and then try to stick to it. I think most writers will tell you that, like, a lot of very successful writers will tell you that they are successful because they write every day. That isn't because they're always, it's in part because they're working on the same project every day. But really what it is that they've trained their brain and their body to be open to ideas. Stephen King calls this the boys in the basement, which is he has a real issue with how muses and ideas are always characterized as sort of pixies that float around above you. And he's like, no. These are blue collar guys covered in dust, and they live in my basement, and they polish bowling trophies. He literally draws this analogy. I have no idea why. But he says they polish bowling trophies, and occasionally they give me ideas. And what they are is my subconscious, because your subconscious is working on problems all the time. All the time. It's why you need to take a walk. It's why you need to take a shower. It's why you need to go out with your friends before the solution presents itself. And so I think, like, in establishing the right routine to save the world, I would sort of build that in, if possible. Like, I would need to hear from the boys in the basement. And writers are very basement-y. Like, I am this, pallid because I live in Toronto, but also I just am a committed indoor kid and always have been. So, there's a lot of just sort of being willing to think out bad scenarios, being willing to sort of be open to a lot of possibilities. Otherwise, like, I would, if it were straight up like the science fiction writers are the only ones who survived, like a Dr. Strangelove, cavern scenario, I would just sort of immediately try to get as much backstory on everyone as possible. I would listen. And then try to figure out, like, keep people apart who had beef, things like that, the basic sort of social things. Because it might be our last time on Earth, and I would rather it be pleasant.
I think you directly answered the question, which is a new thing for academics. Let's open this up to the room. Anybody with questions?
Yeah, on the subject of saving the world, I would like your opinion about the science fiction that I recently started to read, which I find relatively hard to read, was the Three Bodies Problem. And I was just wondering, like, it's a little very different from a lot of other science fiction I've read. And can you kind of do a analysis of it and why, what do you see like innovative about that approach, and how come it doesn't come from like a Western writer?
Read that way?
Yeah.
So the dirty secret about science fiction is that there is no one prose style that defines it. A lot of people sort of when I go to C-suites, the thing that gets asked is like, are you more like Asimov or Heinlein? And I'm like, they were dead before I was born. I have no idea. Are you more like this or are you more like that? It's always dude writers, and it's always they were always dead before I was born. They're usually like people whose work I don't really even terribly like. And so a lot of sort of those guys, sort of the quote unquote, the magazine age, I guess, of science fiction writing, sort of defined a style. In reality, there's as many ways to do it as there are to write a sentence. And you can write a really dense, complicated sentence. You can write the, Hemingway of sentences. If you want to play a fun game, you can run a very dense paragraph into one sentence. You can do Lovecraft versus Hemingway, two styles of American exposition. The way Madness opens is he talks about, strange things seen that drive people mad. And, the Hemingway version is there are some things man was not meant to know. So the three-body problem in other SF novels, like there's, when you are relating these concepts, you can either exposit, straight up tell people, like the Star Wars crawl, in a world where blah, 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 and blah, 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 that kind of thing. Or you can explain everything. You can explain how we got to be in this point in space, blah, blah, blah. Or you can sort of treat it more like method acting. And that's kind of more what I do, which is write in the voice of the person who lives there. Everything that the audience will need to know will come out from there, right? And so that's a way, for me anyway, that like brings more people in, and you're not overburdening them with a huge amount of information. So it's really about like the kind of style of stuff that you like to read, the kind of style that you like to write, and what you think, the audience can stand, and where you think they're at, and who you're trying to appeal to. It's like, the classic question of most fiction is, what are you trying to say, and who are you trying to say it to? And that's also the question around every other kind of communication that exists, whether it's branding or, public safety information, or, a wedding toast, all kinds of things. Those are the two questions that you have to answer. And when you're doing it around fiction, you have to figure those things out, sometimes over successive iterations of a story, I guess. Repetition, yeah. Drafting, what is it, like writing is rewriting? I think that's, yeah, basically it. And if you really want like a very funny like explanation of some of those things, I suggest you check out something called the Turkey City Lexicon, which is Bruce Sterling and a bunch of other writers years and years and years ago wrote a sort of codex or a taxonomy of all the writing terms that they were using in a fiction writer's workshop that shorthanded mistakes that people made. And it can go from White Room Story to the whole universe is a jar of tang to my personal favorite, which is info dumping. And info dumping is when you overburden your reader with like vast amounts of information, which I am guilty of when I'm talking, but I try to avoid when I'm writing.
Hi. I also love info dumping. I'm on the spectrum, so yeah, I get it. It's very real. Two things I liked, and then I'll say my questions. I'm reading Emergent Strategy. I'm in the first chapter. I really like it. So far, so good. And I'm glad you brought up Octavia Butler too. Two, I really like how what you're saying about repetition and diversity and things like that. For me, as a product designer, like I didn't go here, but I graduated a product design degree, you know, but more on the visual side. So reading was more tough, but for me, like the approach of like adaptability and iteration, I was always been really keen on. So I'm glad that, you know, for the writing side of things, or for me on the visual, like tactile side of things, like it's really important. But my question is like, how do you create the conditions for flow state? You know, I think for me, it's something, you know, I'm in this post-grad period, you know, a lot of layoffs, a lot of tech stuff is really bad for entry level. So, you know, for me, I'm doing the more independent, like W-2 isn't working out, I'm doing the 1099 route. So it's like, you know, for me, it's like doing all the contract stuff and creating conditions for me to do the best work. For my question to you is, how do you create those conditions for you to create the best work, or at least iterate, or at least like, you know, get that V1 or get that outline, whatever it is for you?
So the distance between this book that's coming out in August and the one that the last novel that I had written is, depending on how you read history, either 5 years or 8 years. Because there's a trilogy that I've been working on, and I finished that trilogy, and that came out I finished it in 2019, came out in 2020. But before that, the last novel that I wrote for this particular publisher came out in 2016. And during that interval period, I was in the sort of dark night of the soul, long dark tea time of the soul, the what Dante would call the wilderness, in the middle part of our life, the that leads to hell, and I was trying to figure out the answer to that question, like, why can't I do this? This is the thing that I have been doing since I was a child. When I was a little girl, I would recite stories to myself. I would do all funny voices, and I would rehearse them again and again and again until they sounded right to my ear. So I had an ear for fiction before I typed anything. And I knew what a flow state should feel like, because when I was in middle school, one of my social studies teachers was a Fulbright scholar stranded in the suburbs of Western Washington. And he gave us an assignment for Ancient Civ, where he said, like, I want a short story about this civilization. You know, it has to be 5 to 10 pages. And I turned in a 35-page story. And he came to me and said, like, can you see me after class? And I was like, oh no. And I saw him after class, and he's like, I have a proposition. You will write one chapter of a book per unit of class, and I will guarantee you an A if you agree to submit it for publication, which is to say, if you learn how to take it on the chin, which was a lot at 14. But it was the chance to do the thing that I had already been doing and that made me the happiest. So I did it. And it changed my life. Because that experience, when I was at my lowest, I knew it was possible. So one, I had a memory that I could hold on to, that I could recognize that state. I'm like, I know it's clicking. I know it's working. I know that it can be done. And I had a goal, sort of like, this is what it's going to feel like. A lot of foresighters, or a lot of also designers and so on, will tell you, like, you have to have the scenario in mind. You have to have the win condition in mind, because otherwise you'll just sort of grow to nothing. You know, I will have one win. Things will be better when. I will be successful when, right? And then you have to define that. So for me, it was finding the right therapist, getting the right drugs, the right medication, having friends who stuck with me through it, having a husband who stuck with me through it. I would bring up my cat, except he died at the beginning of this month, and then I'll cry, so I can't. But he was a large part of it, despite being very small. So there were systems in place. Now, where did those systems come from? I live in Canada. There's public health. I could see those doctors. That was huge. Like, without it, I don't know where I would be. I wouldn't be here necessarily, right? And so, you know, I would love to claim that I did it. But no, you know, the researchers who got the grants to develop those meds, the people who lobbied for that health system, they did it. I did it with them this time, right? So on the one hand, like, what I would say is forgive yourself. Forgive yourself. Like, start there. And then remember what it felt like when it felt good. What did it feel like in your body when it felt good? And then when it happens, even if it only happens for like this much time, like a picosecond, you'll be on the right track and you'll know to recognize it. And that's, I guess, what I would say. And good luck also.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. So you talked about Parable of the Sower, where Octavia Butler predicted the future in a way. I'll say 1984 also did the same. Both were dystopian. Do you think we have any optimistic futures?
So actually, like, I had a bunch of slides on that and I knew I was running out of time. But I've done other talks on exactly this subject. And this is also an answer about repetition, because there's an ongoing conversation in all publishing, in movie making, in game design, in everything about like, why is everything so dark? And it's like, oh, I don't know, because you're creating content for a generation of people who do gun drills every year. What could it possibly be? I don't know. You know, I was in high school for Columbine and I saw the moment at which everything changed, right? Things were very different. You don't remember this. I do. It was sort of like the high school September 11th, where, you know, suddenly there were all these systems in place that hadn't been there before. On the flip side, there were also a lot more mental health protections that were there. There's a lot of complaints now amongst employers about like, why do our new employees want all these health days? Why do they want all this coverage? Why do they want us to like take these concerns seriously? And it's like possibly because at every assembly they were told that they had to admit if they were feeling badly because otherwise they might die. I don't know. You know, but what I would say in regards to dystopia is like, not only is there a market, you know, things move towards markets. They're easy. They're really easy because history has done all the work for you. All the homework has been done by historians when you're trying to write a dystopia. You just have to put a silver jumpsuit on the bad guys. You just have to put them in, you know, the stormtrooper outfit, which is called the stormtrooper outfit because that's what the Nazis called it. You know, whether it's Hugo Boss designing those uniforms or someone at Lucasfilm, you know, press molding plastic, it is, you know, you're just applying something to a thing that has already happened. And so I tend to think of dystopias as sort of, they're easy because it's sort of same jackboot, different day, right? They're easy to do. Dystopias look the same everywhere. Privation, poverty, disease, a lack of rights, oppression, those things. They look the same everywhere. Utopias, however, are really bespoke. Yours is different from mine, is different from his, is different from hers. There are some people's utopias where I have no rights. They think that's the best of all possible worlds. You know, the famous Oppenheimer quote is, amongst other things, the optimist believes that this is the best of all possible worlds. The pessimist fears this to be true. Right? And so, you know, the utopian ideal is always going to be different for people. And the challenge is all of us coming together and having the courage and the space to sort of step forward and say, like, here's what I want. Here's what I wish for. Here's what I dream of. Because, like, it is one thing to admit your fears. Admitting what you want or what you need is so much harder. It is why people don't ask for help. If it were easy, everyone would ask for help. But the system isn't geared to do that because then we would know how much help everybody needed, right? Instead, we punish people who mention possible problems or mention their own problems. Why are you bringing me problems? Why aren't you bringing me solutions? How can I bring you a solution to a problem that I'm not allowed to name? I don't know. Again, tell a story about it. That tends to help sometimes. But that, we punish that vulnerability. We punish that, our culture in particular sort of punishes that. And so it's a lot harder to imagine the thing that that will nourish everybody, right? And that will meet. That's why instead of utopias, I tend to think in terms of standards. Like this building has building codes. It's designed to keep you safe in a lot of different situations: fire, flood, earthquake, shootings. That's because there are standards for it and regulations around it, right? And that's what we have instead of the utopia. We have criteria and standards to meet and rules to follow, and that's it. And I'm not saying like more rules or whatever, but I'm saying standards are nice. Standards are good. You will find this, those of you who are dating. But they're good. They're just generally good. I don't know who was first. I know that. Oh, are we at time?
Navarro, are we allowed to go one more?
Fine.
Telling Canadians how America is.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure.
Hey, I'd like to follow up on your previous answer.
Sure.
You mentioned that my utopia may not be the same as yours. It's funny that all of our dystopias essentially die down to the same thing, which is everyone's being watched. There's no social communication anymore. Things are going bad for humanity. Mm-hmm. But has anyone ever tried addressing a common utopia where you set down a premise, which is everyone's an individual is happy doing what they're doing. Someone's happiness doesn't mean someone else's sadness. Mm-hmm. And everyone is striving for purpose and a few of these criteria, and then reverse engineering your way into how society would be. Has anyone tried to address this as a book, as an article, or whatever?
I mean, I think a lot of writers try to do that. Like there's sort of I'm going to show you this. I'm going to show you the shining depiction of something, this wonderful land of Oz, and then I'm going to tell you how the land of Oz got to be that way. Or I'm going to show you this place, and then we're going to talk about how this came about. Probably the one that leaps to mind is Ian Banks, Ian M. Banks in the culture novels. My friend Carl Schrader does this a lot. Lady of Mazes is kind of like this. And Son of Sons, I want to say, is kind of like this. I read all these novels in draft, so they're kind of like in the ether in a weird way, because I never know how they'll exactly settle down. One of the things about reading people's work before it's published in manuscript or in draft form is that you get the bones of the thing and not the fine tuning. It's like a cake without frosting on it, kind of. You know what flavor it's going to be and you know what it's going to look like, but the rosettes aren't there. It doesn't have sprinkles on it. So there's kind of a I'm speaking from not the final experience of some of these books, but I would say that's where I would start. And then I would say also, if you are looking to cultivate this capacity in yourself, if you want that space for ideas, or you want that space for, that flow state, if you want that space for those things, and there isn't that space for you, you're crowded into your room, you're crowded into, you don't have office space, you don't have a room of your own, you don't have 2 minutes a day to think, you don't have those things. What I would say is read. And if you can, read from paper. Because unlike your phone and unlike your tablet, a paper book is not reading you back. It doesn't report to your parents with spyware. It doesn't report to whomever else with spyware. There are, in fact, laws about what the library can say to the government about what you checked out. It's more anonymous than the internet, in fact. And so, also, because it's not constantly pinging you, you'll get that flow state of reading and you'll be alone in your own mind. And when you are alone in your own mind, it's very hard at first, especially if there's something that you've been sort of like holding a lid on like this. It'll jump forward, and that's uncomfortable. Some people experience this with like meditation. They're sort of like, I went crazy, I flipped out, it's like, well, yeah, all the bad thoughts that you had been sort of holding down like this all jumped forward because they finally had the space to do so. But that can happen when you create that room. So if you don't have the room, if you don't have like the physical space, there is always more room up here, right? And the more room that you have up here, the more you will have in here. So start there.
That was great. Can you tell us?
So to not end on like crying about my cat, I will tell you a funny story about possibility and being an American in Canada. I'm an American in Canada. My mom's a cancer survivor. If she were Canadian, her experience of cancer would have been very different. My experience of being a kid going to university while she had cancer and my dad lost his job would also have been very different. But the way that the illustration that leaps to mind, that is also a story about possibility and future possibilities, is I was on Facebook shortly before I stopped checking into it. And there was another Canadian there, and I just sort of, I saw this thing, Facebook kind of coughed it up for me because it had a lot of, like, you know, it was causing emotional contagion, which is the metric of success for platforms. And in it was this post that someone said, I've known Americans all my life. I've lived next door to America all my life, and I never understood. I just now today, I'm in my 30s, and I've just now today realized that Americans pay to give birth. That childbirth costs money, that you're charged for it. And in fact, you are. Like, depending on the quality of your plan, you can pay very little upfront, or, you know, if you need specialty care, it's like an easy 40 grand. You know, baby or Lexus, you choose. That's the choice, you know. Or baby, like, I don't know, year of tuition. I don't know how much, you know, whatever it is, but that's, and then like with, you know, it depends, right? Your baby is early. Your baby has health issues. You get the top of the line anesthesiologist. I don't know. It costs money. And she, as a Canadian, had never understood that. It had never entered her mind. It was impossible. Like, she had not thought that anywhere could be that cruel. It was unfathomable to her. And I felt like saying, like, why do you think I left? I don't have children, but I like knowing that I wouldn't necessarily pay to give birth, unless, of course, you know, Doug Ford, the premier of my province, has his way. But it's one of the differences, and it's one of the reasons that, you know, when you look at Paris in the 20s, when you look at communities, when you look at like New York in the 80s, when real estate was cheap, when you look at parts of Canada, why are all these writers here? Like, especially in genre, you know, people will say like, gosh, there's a lot of science fiction writers, there's a lot of horror writers, there's a lot of fantasy writers that are Canadians, they're secretly Canadians. Why would that be? I don't know, possibly because there was funding for the library to do a sci-fi writer in residence, and then it turned into the largest science fiction collection in America, or in North America. There was money. It got funded. Like, that's the answer. It got funded. And it's way easier to be an artist when you know that, like, stubbing your toe is not going to bankrupt you or whatever. Like, that's it. And, you know, I would love for it to be a more highfalutin answer, but that's it. Or at least it's the start.